The time has come for the Cobra to rise up and reveal himself.
Welcome back, my quiver of capitalists. The all-American American history teacher, gold standard of economics, sensei of supply side, Professor G here, presenting AP Economics, presented by Cobranomics. And today, at unit number 4, lesson 4, before we get into our founder, the stylin' and profilin', wheelin' and dealin', John Maynard Keynes, before we get into his mathematical and economic theory, first we have to look at the vehicle in which that theory is going to take place, and that is fiscal policy. So in today's lesson we are going to break down what is fiscal policy and how it is used in expansionary and contractionary policy, and the different key vocabulary words that are associated with it to make the mathematical aspect of it, John Maynard Keynes' use of fiscal policy, even more clear. So, fiscal policy is the ability of government, and when we say the government, specifically in the United States, it is Congress. All spending bills start in the House, then they must be approved by the Senate, and then when both houses agree on a spending bill, that must then be signed by the president. If the president doesn't approve of that spending bill, it gets kicked back down to the lower chambers, to the Senate, and then the House. They have to come up with a new bill, and then the president, the executive branch, signs and executes that spending bill. So be careful, because this is specifically only the power of the government. And what the AP test likes to do is they like to try to trip you up with fiscal policy, which is the United States, which is the domestic government, and it is only that government's ability to tax and to spend. And the AP test likes to try to trip you up with fiscal policy versus monetary policy. That's our next unit. That is the power of the central bank in the banking system. So fiscal policy is only the government's ability to tax and to spend. And if you remember the circular flow model, government is in the middle of that circular flow model in the mixed economy, and the government can take taxes from both households and businesses and can spend money for both households and businesses. So these are the two government powers. And there are two types of, when we talk about fiscal policy, we are usually talking about discretionary policy. So within this, there's discretionary spending versus automatic stabilizers. Discretionary spending is Congress takes specific actions that will change spending and that will change taxes. So discretionary spending, as Congress is taking a specific action. They are passing new legislation that changes spending or taxes. Automatic stabilizers also sometimes appear on the AP test, and automatic stabilizers have been created from previous fiscal policy, and they are now part of our economy. So stabilizers already in place from previous policies that don't need, that is the main part of it, that's why they're automatic. They don't need government action to occur. And they're in place so that people, so for one, especially for a recession, that people don't have to wait for the government to do something in order to start fighting a recession. Like, for example, unemployment benefits. If a person should get unemployed, they do not have to wait for the government to pass legislation. They could go to the unemployment office and fill out an application and start receiving an income from the state government, unemployment benefits. Unemployment benefits could be further altered by future fiscal policy, like when President Obama, during the Great Recession, President Obama and Congress passed legislation that discretionary spending that extended unemployment benefits for 99 weeks during the Great Recession. Similarly, in the 2020 pandemic, Congress and President Trump passed legislation that added an additional unemployment benefit, a pandemic unemployment benefit, to the already existing unemployment benefits. So automatic stabilizers can be altered by discretionary spending. But if you're unemployed, you do not have to wait for discretionary spending to occur. Automatic stabilizers are also in place to fight inflation as well. For example, progressive tax: when you earn more money, you go into a higher tax bracket and are taxed more. And this is what taxing does. Taxing is government revenue, and it takes our gross income and taxes it, and then what we have left is our disposable income, which we'll take a look at in our next slide. First, let's take a look at the keyword of taxes. Taxes represent the main source of government revenue, and as we remember from the circular flow model, with government in the middle, government can take taxes from both households and from businesses. And there are many different types of taxes that the government has. And when we take a look at taxes, especially just taking a look at households, but this is true for businesses as well, we have to break our income down into two categories because of taxes. First, we have our gross income. This is the income that represents what should be the fruits of your labor. This is your salary if you're making $50,000 a year, or it is your hourly wage, and that's the starting amount. That's the amount that you are supposed to make, unadjusted for. This is pre-tax. This is your pre-tax amount. This is the amount that you signed in your contract, the amount in your salary, the amount of your wage. However, you pay taxes, we pay taxes once per paycheck, and we also pay taxes again. So the paycheck taxes we pay, let's take a look at one of Professor G's paychecks. Government takes out Social Security tax, Medicare tax, federal income tax, state income tax, and local income tax. And that is just per paycheck. Take that, taxes. And we also pay taxes. So that's twice a month, bi-weekly paycheck, we pay taxes. We additionally pay our yearly income tax. That's the tax due on April 15th, and that's if the government says that during your bi-weekly paychecks, did they take out too much, too little, or just the right amount, in which case, after you fill out your 1040 form, you might either owe, break even, or receive some money back. But during the year, we have our gross salary. That is just the headline salary that we are supposed to make, that's supposed to represent the fruits of our labor. Government, as I just read, taxes that. If you live in New York City, you get taxed 5 times per paycheck. And that leaves us with our net or disposable income. This is the number, the disposable income, that we are going to focus our math on when we take a look at John Maynard Keynes's how he uses fiscal policy. With the idea of taxes now, and the idea that taxes represent the source of government revenue, now we're going to take a look at government budget. And the government budget, just like any personal budget, represents the amount of spending versus income. And that's for any home budget, and it's also for the government as well. It is for the government budget, the national budget, it is the relationship of government spending to taxes, to its revenue. And just like with any household budget, there are 3 outcomes that could happen. The most basic outcome that we want as a household, and the same thing that the government wants, is government spending. If government spending equals taxes, this is called a balanced budget, that the government spends what it makes. If government spending is below taxes, if taxes are less than taxes, if taxes are greater than government spending, this is called a budget surplus. This is in the black. You are earning more than you spend. For households, this is how savings accumulates. That we spend less than we earn. That extra money becomes our own personal savings. But if government spending is greater than taxes, this is called a budget deficit. That means that the government is spending money it does not have. In our next slide, we're going to take a look at how do we spend money? How does the government spend money that it does not have? Now, let's take a look at what deficit spending means. So we said that, well, how does the government spend more than it earns? Very similar to how we spend more than we earn with a credit card. A credit card, when you swipe your credit card, you are engaged in deficit spending. So what does that mean? That means you are borrowing money. When you swipe your credit card, you are borrowing money from the bank. You are not using your money, you are borrowing money. So you are engaging in deficit spending. And I like to use my bathtub analogy. So deficit spending is the act of borrowing in order to spend greater than your revenue. It is like turning the water on in a bathtub. And as the water comes on in the bathtub, it starts to... That water filling up in blue is our debt. Debt is the burden of borrowing, the amount that must be paid back. So deficit spending, turning on the bathtub, creates the debt burden. It will increase the national debt and will increase your own personal debt. So when you swipe your credit card, you are engaging in deficit spending. At the end of the month, you have to pay back your debt, the burden you owe from using your credit card to deficit spend. So deficit spending creates debt. Get out of here, credit card debt. Yeah. Now, as soon as you turn off the deficit, the reason why it is a burden, let's say the government stops deficit spending. That water is still in the bathtub. And the government, just like personal finance, must pay off that debt. And that debt is a burden because that debt, why did the bank lend money? So the bank can charge you interest. And the longer it takes off to pay your debt, the more and more interest that we as households have to pay, and interest the government has to pay as well. Now, for the final aspect of fiscal policy, so deficit spending and fiscal policy, spending is greater than revenue. In order to do that, the government must deficit spend. As the government deficit spends, it increases the national debt. And be very careful when we say this is called not an increase or decrease in deficit spending, but when it is a movement toward deficit. Because you cannot actually increase or decrease a deficit. You can increase or decrease deficit spending, but it's a movement toward budget deficit. So very specific that, or a movement toward, so there's either a movement toward deficit, or if revenue is greater than spending, we would say movement towards surplus. So be very careful when we talk about budgets, for every budget, we're going to come back to this later in the course as well. When we talk about budget, we say movement toward budget deficit or movement toward budget surplus. When we talk about debt, we're going to see that it is either an increase, so we'd say a movement toward deficit would be an increase in debt. Now let's take a look at, with all of our vocabulary words, how a government would do an expansionary fiscal or a contractionary fiscal policy, putting all of our words together. So now let's put all of our words, our key vocabulary words around fiscal policy together. The two situations in which the government would use fiscal policy to either fight recession or inflation. To fight recession, the government would use an expansionary fiscal policy. What that means is the government is trying to expand the economy. It's trying to increase spending in the economy. So to increase spending, government would increase its own spending and decrease taxes as well, which would, a decrease in taxes, would increase our net income. However, how can the government increase spending while decreasing revenue? As we said before, it would have to move toward a budget deficit. It would have to borrow in order to spend the money. If it doesn't have the revenue to spend the money, it has to make that gap up. It makes that gap up with borrowing money. If the government borrows money, so it would move toward a budget deficit. If the government borrows money, it would then increase the national debt burden, the amount of money that the government owes. If a nation is experiencing inflation, the government can use its fiscal powers to create a contractionary fiscal policy, a policy to shrink the economy, to reduce spending in the economy, because if we have bad inflation, we have too much money chasing too few products, we are spending too much, and that is increasing the price level and crushing purchasing power. So a contractionary fiscal policy is designed to shrink the economy on purpose to reduce spending in the economy, to bring the price level down, to decrease aggregate demand, bringing the price level down. To do this, the government will decrease spending and increase taxes. Now the government is earning more than it spends. This is called a movement toward surplus, and we could assume that now that the government has extra money, one of the things it can do with that money is to decrease the national debt, to start paying off that debt burden. Much like, this is why credit card debt is bad for households, because if you have too much credit card debt, once you are ahead, part of you being ahead now has to go back towards paying previous purchases. So that's why the expression is, you can drown in debt. You always want to try to balance your budget or have a surplus, so this way you do not have your own personal debt burden, and minimize that as much as possible. In our next lesson, we are going to take a look at the math and theory from our founder, John Maynard Keynes, that really hammers out and specifically outlines how to do this effectively, expansionary fiscal policy effectively and responsibly, and to its maximum effect. Until next time, keep the venom flowing. Thanks for watching. Remember, money, mind or body, invest hard, invest often, and no feelings. Money never sleeps.